Hello and welcome to this second look exploring session looking at Bosworth Field by Sir John Beaumont. It is not a play, it is a narrative poem on the story of Bosworth Field, and it is one that we have not only looked at before as a first look, stopping and starting, but we're also working towards a actual performance of this live on stage, which hopefully, if things go well, will be live streamed as well, and certainly the audio version of that will be available on the podcast in the future. And so there is a little more sense of urgency from me to make sure that the script is accurate and that it sort of flows and dances. So we're asking very much the question as to which parts of the history of this gets confusing, as to which parts, especially when people use variations on their name from their family name to their title to their individual actual names to etc., where sometimes that gets a little confusing, and how much editorial work we might want to do when we actually do the performance, and which probably by the time you see this will be in the past, but for us it's in the future. It's all wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. So we've broken the text into various parts. They're all entirely artificial, it's just one narrative flow, but reading are the narrator, who will be following mostly through the realm of Richard's side. Narrator number one is
Aliki, Chapple. Inappropriately in Lancashire at the moment. But there you go.
Reading the narrator following Richmond, or the future Henry VII, Henry Tudor. Narrator number two is
Lois Potter here in London.
Reading Richard III is
My black hat. Hi, I'm Lynn. I live in the northwestern United States.
And in the blue corner, or the white and red corner, reading Richmond, as well as Catesby, Surrey and Bourchier. Video may pop in and out, depending on internet connection, is
Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm in the neutral, I believe, Wokingham.
Reading Henry VI, deceased, Ferrers, Hungerford and Percy, is
Alan, neutral in Suffolk.
Reading Norfolk, Clifton, Scout, Brackenbury and Oxford, not necessarily in that order, is
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm inappropriate at any time of day.
And joining us for the first time, leaping into the deep end, reading Stanley, Bryon and Talbot, is
Rachel from Canada.
And I'm your host, Robert Crighton. I will be reading nothing because I'm there watching everybody else do it and tidying up the text as we go. So we're going to run this at pace. We're going to see how it flows. So we'll now draw in. It's the early morning in August in 1485, and this is a pivotal moment in history as we hand you over to narrator number one.
The winter's storm of civil war I sing, whose end is crowned with our eternal spring, where roses joined, their colours mixed in one, and armies fight no more for England's throne. Thou gracious Lord, direct my feeble pen, who from the actions of ambitious men hast, by thy goodness, drawed our joyful good, and made sweet flowers and olives grow from blood, while we, delighted with this fair release, may climb Parnassus in the days of peace. The king, whose eyes were never fully closed, whose mind, oppressed with fearful dreams, supposed that he in blood had wallowed all the night, leaps from his restless bed before the light. Accused Tyrrell is the first he spies, accursed Tyrrell is the first he spies, whom, threatening with his dagger, thus he cries,
How darest thou, villain, so disturb my sleep? Were not the smothered children buried deep? And hath the ground been ripped by thee, that I their rotten carcasses might see?
The wretch, astonished, hastes away to slide, as damned ghosts themselves in darkness hide, and calls up three whose counsels could assuage the sudden swellings of the prince's rage. Ambitious Lovell, who to gain his grace had stained the honour of his noble race. Perfidious Catesby, by whose curious skill the law was taught to speak his master's will, and Ratcliffe, deeply learned in courtly art, who best could search into his sovereign's heart. Affrighted Richard labours to relate his hideous dreams as signs of helpless fate.
Alas,
Said they.
Such fictions children fear. These are not terrors showing danger near, but motives sent by some propitious power to make you watchful at this early hour. Though these prove that your victorious care prevents your slothful foes that slumber in their tents. This precious time must not in vain be spent, which God, your help, by heavenly means have lent.
He, by these false conjectures, much appeased, contemning fancies, which his mind diseased, replies,
I should have been ashamed to tell fond dreams to wise men, whether heaven or hell or troubled nature these effects hath wrought. I know this day requires another thought. If some resistless strength my cause should cross, fear will increase and not redeem the loss. All dangers clouded with the mists of fear seem great far off, but lessen coming near. Away, ye black illusions of the night! If ye combine with fortune, have the might to hinder my designs, ye shall not bar my courage seeking glorious death in war.
thus being cheered, he calls aloud for arms and bids that all should rise, whom Morpheus charms.
Bring me,
Saith he,
the harness that I wore at Tewkesbury, which from that day no more have felt the batteries of a civil strife, nor stood between destruction and my life.
On his breastplate he beholds a dint, which in that field young Edward's sword did print. This stirs remembrance of his heinous guilt, when he that prince's blood so foully spilt. Now fully armed, he takes his helmet bright, which like a twinkling star, with trembling light sends radiant luster through the darksome air. This mask will make his wrinkled visage fair. But when his head is covered with the steel, he tells his servants that his temples feel deep piercing stings, which breed unusual pains, and of the heavy burden much complains. Some mark his words as tokens framed to express the sharp conclusion of a sad success. Then going forth and finding in his way a soldier of the watch, who sleeping lay, enraged to see the wretch neglect his part, he strikes a sword into his trembling heart, the hand of death, and iron dullness takes those leaden eyes which natural ease forsakes. The king this morning sacrifice commends, and for example thus the fact defends. I leave him as I found him, fit to keep the silent doors of everlasting sleep.
Still Richmond slept, for worldly care and fear have times of pausing when the soul is clear. While heaven's director, whose revengeful brow would to the guilty head no rest allow, looks on the other part with milder eyes. At his command an angel swiftly flies from sacred truth's perspicuous gate to bring a crystal vision on his golden wing. This lord, thus sleeping, thought he saw and knew his lamb-like uncle, whom that tiger slew, whose powerful words encourage him to fight.
Go on, just scourge of murder, virtue's light. The combat which thou shalt this day endure makes England's peace for many ages sure. Thy strong invasion cannot be withstood. The earth assists thee with the cry of blood. The heavens shall bless thy hopes and crown thy joys. See how their fiends with loud and dismal noise, presaging vultures, greedy of their prey, on Richard's tents their scaly wings display.
The holy king then offered to his view a lively tree on which 3 branches grew. But when the hope of fruit had made him glad, all fell to dust, at which the earl was sad. Yet comfort comes again when from the root he sees a bough into the north to shoot, which, nourished there, extends itself from thence and girds this island with a firm defense. There he beholds a high and glorious throne, where sits a king by laurel garlands known. Like bright Apollo in the Muses' choirs, his radiant eyes are watchful heavenly fires. beneath his feet, pale envy bites her chain, and snaky discord whets her sting in vain.
Thou seest,
Said Henry,
wise and potent James, this is he whose happy union tames the savage feuds and shall those lets deface, which keeps the borders from a dear embrace. Both nations shall in Britain's royal crown their differing names, the signs of faction drown. The silver streams, which from this spring increase, bedew all Christian hearts with drops of peace. Observe how hopeful Charles is born to assuage the winds that would disturb this golden age. And that great king shall full of glory leave earth's base, then may this prince receive the diadem without his father's wrong, may take it late and may possess it long. Above all Europe's princes shine now bright, God's selected care and man's delight.
Here gentle sleep forsook his clouded brows, and full of holy thoughts and pious vows, he kissed the ground as soon as he arose, when watchful Digby, who among his foes had wandered unsuspected all the night, reports that Richard is prepared to fight.
Long since, the king had thought it time to send for trusty Norfolk, his undaunted friend, who, hasting from the place of his abode, found at the door a world of papers strewed. Some would affright him from the tyrant's side, affirming that his master was betrayed. Some laid before him all those bloody deeds from which a line of sharp revenge proceeds with much compassion, that so brave a knight should serve a lord against whom angels fight. And others put suspicions in his mind that Richard most observed was most unkind. The Duke, awhile these cautious words revolves with serious thoughts, and thus at last resolves.
If all the camp prove traitors to my lord, shall spotless Norfolk falsify his word. Mine oath is past. I swore to uphold his crown, and that shall swim, or I with it will drown. It is too late now to dispute the right. Dare any tongue, since York spread forth his light, Northumberland, or Buckingham defame, two valiant Cliffords ruse, or Beaumont's name, because they in the weaker quarrel die? They had the king with them, and so have I. But every eye the face of Richard shuns, for that foul murder of his brother's sons. Yet laws of knighthood gave me not a sword to strike at him, who all with joint accord have made my prince, to whom I tribute bring. I hate his vices, but adore the king. Victorious Edward, if thy soul can hear, thy servant Howard, I devoutly swear, that to have saved thy children from that day, my hopes on earth should willingly decay. Would Gloucester then my perfect faith had tried, and made two graves when noble Hastings died.
This said, his troops he into order draws, then doubled haste redeems his former pause. So stops the sailor for a voyage bound, when on the sea he hears the tempests sound, till pressing hunger to remembrance sends that on his course his household's life depends. With this he clears the doubts that vexed his mind, and puts his ship to mercy of the wind. The Duke's stout presence and courageous looks were to the king as falls of sliding brooks, which bring a gentle and delightful rest to weary eyes with grievous care oppressed. He bids that Norfolk and his hopeful son, whose rising fame in arms this day begun, should lead the vanguard. For so great command he dares not trust in any other hand. The rest he to his own device refers, and as the spirit in that body stirs, then putting on his crown, a fatal sign, so offered beasts near death in garlands shine. He rides about the ranks and strives to inspire each breast with part of his unwearied fire. To those who had his brother's servants been, and had the wonders of his valor seen, he saith,
My fellow soldiers, though your swords are sharp and need not whetting by my words, Yet call to mind those many glorious days in which we treasured up immortal praise. If when I served, I ever fled from foe, fly ye from mine, let me be punished so. But if my father, when at first he tried how all his sons could shining blades abide, found me an eagle, whose undazzled eyes affront the beams which from the steel arise, and if I now in action teach the same, know then ye have but changed your general's name. Be still yourselves, you fight against the dross of those that oft have run from you with loss. How many Somersets, dissensions, bands have felt the force of our revengeful hands, from whom this youth, as from a princely flood, derives his best, yet not untainted blood. Have our assaults made Lancaster to droop, and shall this Welshman with his ragged troop subdue the Norman and the Saxon line, that only Merlin may be thought divine? See what a guide these fugitives have chose, who, bred among the French, our ancient foes, forgets the English language and the ground, and knows not what our drums and trumpets sound.
To others' minds their willing oaths he draws. He tells his just decrees and healthful laws, and makes large proffers of his future grace. Thus having ended, with as cheerful face as nature, which his stepdame still was thought could lend to one, without proportion wrought, some with loud shouting make the valleys ring, but most with a murmur sigh.
God
Save the king!
Now, careful Henry sends his servant Bray to Stanley, who accounts it safe to stay, and dares not promise, lest his haste should bring his son to death, now prisoner with the king.
About the same time Brackenbury came, and thus to Stanley saith in Richard's name,
My lord, the king salutes you and commands that to his aid you bring your ready bands, or else, he swears by him that sits on high, before the armies join, your son shall die.
At this the Lord stood like a man that hears the judge's voice, which condemnation bears. Till gathering up his spirits, he replies,
My fellow Hastings' death hath made me wise, more than my dream could him, for I no more will trust the tushes of the angry boar. If with my George's blood he stain his throne, I thank my God I have more sons than one. Yet to secure his life I quiet stand, against the king, not lifting up my hand.
The messenger departs, of hope denied.
Then noble Stanley, taking Bray aside, saith,
Let my son proceed, without despair, assisted by his mother's alms and prayer. God will direct them both him and me to take best courses for that blessed woman's sake.
The earl by this delay was not inclined to fear nor anger, knowing Stanley's mind, but calling all his chief commanders near, he boldly speaks while they attentive hear.
It is in vain, brave friends, to show the right which are forced to seek by civil fight. Our swords are brandished in a noble cause, to free your country from a tyrant's laws. That angry planet, what a disastrous sign, directs Plantagenet's afflicted line. Ah, was it not enough that mutual rage in deadly battle should this race enrage, till by their blows themselves they fewer make, and pillars fall which France could never shake? But must this crooked monster now be found to lay rough hands on that unclosed wound? Excuse me. His secret plots have much increased the flood. He with his brothers and his nephew's blood have stained the brightness of his father's flowers, and made his own white rose as red as ours. This is the day whose splendor puts to fight obscuring clouds and brings an age of light. We see no hindrance of those wished times, but this usurper whose But this usurper whose depressing crimes will drive him from the mountain where he stands, so that he needs must fall without our hands. In this we happy are, that by our arms both York and Lancaster revenge their harms. Here Henry's servants join with Edward's friends, and leave their private griefs for public ends.
Thus, ceasing, he implores
the Almighty's grace,
and bids that
every captain takes his place.
His speech was answered with a general noise of acclamations, doubtless signs of joys which soldiers uttered as they forward went, the sure forerunners of a fair event. So, when the winter to the spring bequeaths the rule of time, and mild Favonius breathes, a choir of swans to that sweet music sings, the air resounds, the motion of their wings, when over plains they fly in ordered ranks to sport themselves upon Caister's banks. Bold Oxford leads the vanguard up amain, whose valiant offers heretofore were vain, when he his love to Lancaster expressed. But now, with more indulgent fortune blessed, his men he toward Norfolk's quarter drew, and straight the one the other's ensigns knew, for they in several armies were displayed, this oft in Edward's, that in Henry's aid. The sad remembrance of those bloody fights incensed new anger in these noble knights. A marish lay between, which Oxford leaves upon his right hand, and the son receives behind him, with advantage of the place, for Norfolk must endure it on his face. And yet his men advance their spears and swords against this succor which the heaven affords. His horse and foot possessed the field in length, while bowmen went before them for their strength. Thus, marching forth, they set on Oxford's band. He fears their number, and with strict command his soldiers closely to the standard draws.
Then Howard's troops, amazed, begin to pause. They doubt the sleights of battle and prepare to guard their valor with a trench of care.
This sudden stop made warlike Vere more bold, to see their fury in a moment cold. His ranks he in a larger form displays, which all were archers, counted in those days the best of English soldiers, for their skill could guide their shafts according to their will. The feathered wood they from their bows let fly. No arrow fell, but caused some man to die. So painful bees, with forward gladness strive to join themselves in throngs before the hive, and with obedience till that hour attend when their commander shall his watchword send. Then to the winds their tender sails they yield, depress the flowers, depopulate the field.
Wise Norfolk, to avoid these shafts the more, contrives his battle thin and sharp before. He thus attempts to pierce into the heart and break the order of the adverse part, as when the cranes direct their flight on high to cut their way, they in a trigon fly, which pointed figure may with ease divide opposing blasts, through which they swiftly glide.
But now the wings make haste to Oxford's aid. The left by valiant Savage was displayed. His lusty soldiers were attired in white. They move like drifts of snow, whose sudden fright constrains the weary passenger to stay, and beating on his face confounds his way. Brave Talbot led the right, whose grandsire's name was his continual spur to purchase fame. Both these rushed in,
while Norfolk, like a wall which, oft with engines cracked, disdains to fall, maintains his station by defensive fight, till Surrey, pressing forth with youthful might, sends many shadows to the gates of death, when dying mouths had gasped forth purple breath. His father follows, Age and former pains had made him slower, yet he still retains his ancient vigor, and with much delight to see his son do marvels in his sight, he seconds him, and from the branches cleaves those clusters which the former vintage leaves.
Now Oxford flies as lightning through his troops, and with his presence cheers the part that droops. His brave endeavours Surrey's force restrain, like banks at which the ocean storms in vain.
The swords and armours shine as sparkling coals, their clashing drowns the groans of parting souls. The peaceful neighbours, who had long desired to find the causes of their fear expired, are newly grieved to see this scarlet flood, and English ground bedewed with English blood.
Stout Rice and Herbert lead the power of Wales. Their zeal to Henry moves the hills and dales to sound their countryman's beloved name, who shall restore the British offspring's fame. These make such slaughter with their glaives and hooks that careful bards may fill their precious books with praises which from warlike actions spring, and take new themes when to their harps they sing. Besides these soldiers born within this isle, we must not of their part the French beguile, whom Charles for Henry's succour did provide. A lord of Scotland, Bernard, was their guide, a blossom of the Stuarts' happy line, which is on Britain's throne ordained to shine. The sun whose rays the heaven with beauty crown, from his ascending to his going down, saw not a braver leader in that age. And Bosworth Field must be the glorious stage in which this northern eagle learns to fly, and tries those wings which after raise him high, when he beyond the snowy Alps renowned shall plant French lilies in Italian ground, and cause the craggy Apennine to know what fruits on Caledonian mountains grow. Now, in this civil war, the troops of France their banners dare on English air advance, and on their lances' points destruction bring to fainting servants of the guilty king, when heretofore they had no power to stand against our armies in their native land, but melting fled as wax before the flame, dismayed with thunder of St. George's name. Now Henry, with his uncle Pembroke, moves the rearward on, and Stanley then approves his love to Richmond's person and his cause. He from his army of 3,000 draws a few choice men, and bids the rest obey his valiant brother, who shall prove this day as famous as great Warwick, in whose hand the fate of England's crown was thought to stand. With these he closely steals to help his friend, while his main forces stir not, but attend the younger Stanley.
And to Richard's eye appear not parties, but as standers by. Yet Stanley's words so much the king incense that he exclaims,
"This is a false pretense. His doubtful answer shall not save his son. Young Strange shall die. See, Catesby, this be done."
Now like a lamb which, taken from the folds, the slaughterman with rude embraces holds, and for his throat prepares a whetted knife, so goes this harmless lord to end his life. The axe is sharpened and the block prepared, but worthy Ferrers equal portion shared of grief and terror, which the prisoner felt. His tender eyes in tears of pity melt, and hasting to the king, he boldly said,
"Lord, too many bloody stains are laid by envious tongues upon your peaceful reign. Oh, may their malice ever speak in vain. Afford not this advantage to their spite. None should be killed today, but in the fight. Your crown is strongly fixed, your cause is good. Cast not upon it drops of harmless blood. His life is nothing, yet it will dearly cost, if while you seek it, we perhaps have lost occasions of your conquest thither fly, where rebels armed with cursed blades shall die, and yield in death to your victorious oar. Naked hands be censured by the law."
Such power his speech and seemly action hath, it mollifies the tyrant's bloody wrath, and he commands that
Stranger's death be stayed.
the noble youth, who was before dismayed at death's approaching sight, now sweetly cleans his cloudy sorrows and forgets his fears, as when a steer to burning altars led, expecting fatal blows to cleave his head, as by the priest for some religious cause, sent back to live, and now in quiet draws the open air and takes his wonted food, and never thinks how near to death he stood. The king, though ready, yet his march delayed to have Northumberland's expected aid, to him industrious Ratcliffe swiftly hies, but Percy greets him thus.
My troubled eyes this night beheld my father's angry ghost, advising not to join with Richard's host. Wilt thou, said he, so much obscure my shield, to bear mine azure lion in the field with such a general? Ask him on which side his sword was drawn, when I at Towton died.
When Richard knew that both his hopes were vain, he forward sets with cursing and disdain, and cries,
Who would not all these lords detest, when Percy changeth, like the moon, his crest?
This speech the heart of noble Ferrers rent. He answers,
Sir, though many dare repent that which they cannot now, but without your wrong, and only grieve they have been true too long, my breast shall never bear so foul a stain, if any ancient blood in me remain, which from the Norman conquerors took descent, shall be wholly in your service spent. I will obtain today, alive or dead, the crowns that grace a faithful soldier's head.
Blessed be thy tongue.
replies the king.
In thee the strength of all thine ancestors I see, extending warlike arms for England's good. By thee their heir in valor as in blood.
But here we leave the king, and must review those sons of Mars who cruel blades imbrue in rivers sprung from hearts that bloodless lie, and stain their shining arms in sanguine dye. Here valiant Oxford and fierce Norfolk meet, and with their spears each other rudely greet. About the air the shivered pieces play, then on their swords their noble hands they lay. And Norfolk first a blow directly guides to Oxford's head, which from his helmet slides upon his arm, and biting through the steel, inflicts a wound, which Vere disdains to feel. He lifts his falchion with a threatening grace, and hews the beaver off from Howard's face. This being done, he with compassion charmed retires, ashamed to strike a man disarmed. But straight a deadly shaft sent from a bow, whose master, though far off the Duke could know, untimely brought this combat to an end, and pierced the brain of Richard's constant friend. When Oxford saw him sink, his noble soul was full of grief, which made him thus condole.
Farewell, true knight, to whom no costly grave can give due honor. Would my tears might save those streams of blood, deserving to be spilt in better service, had not Richard's guilt such heavy weight upon his fortune laid. His glorious virtues had his sins outweighed.
Courageous Talbot had with Surrey met, and after many blows begins to fret that one so young in arms should thus unmoved resist his strength, so oft in war approved. And now the earl beholds his father fall, whose death like horrid darkness frighted all. Some give themselves as captives, others fly, but this young lion casts his generous eye on Mowbray's lion painted in his shield, and with that king of beasts repines to yield.
The field
Saith he,
in which the lion stands is blood, and blood I offer to the hands of daring foes. But never shall my flight dye black my lion, which as yet is white.
His enemies, like cunning huntsmen, strive in binding snares to take their prey alive, while he desires to expose his naked breast and thinks the sword that deepest strikes is best. Young Howard, single, with an army fights, when, moved with pity, two renowned knights, strong Clarendon and valiant Conyers, try to rescue him, in which attempt they die. For savage, red with blood of slaughtered foes, doth them in midst of all his troops enclose, where, though the captain for their safety strives, yet baser hands deprive them of their lives. Now Surrey, fainting, scarce his sword can hold, which made a common soldier grow so bold to lay rude hands upon that noble flower, which he, disdaining, anger gives him power, erects his weapon with a nimble round, and sends the peasant's arm to kiss the ground. This done, to Talbot he presents his blade, and saith,
It is not hope of light have made this my submission, but my strength is spent, and some perhaps a villain blood will vent my soul. This favour I demand, that I may.
May God forbid that any of my name
Quoth Talbot,
should put out so bright a flame as burns in thee, brave youth. Where thou hast erred, 'twas thy father's fault, since he preferred a tyrant's crown before the juster side.
The Earl, still mindful of his birth, replied,
I wonder, Talbot, that thy noble heart insults on ruins of the vanquished part. We had the right, if now to you it flow. The fortune of your swords have made it so. I never will my luckless choice repent, and nor can it stay my set England wreath upon stake. There will I signs, the duty in my thoughts, not faction, shines.
the earnest soldiers still the chase pursue, but their commanders grieve they should imbrue their swords in blood, which springs from English vein. The peaceful sound of trumpets them restrains from further slaughter, which with a mild retreat to rest contented in this first defeat.
The king intended at his setting out to help his vanguard, but a nimble scout runs crying,
Sir, I saw not far from hence where Richmond hovers with the small defence, and like one guilty of some heinous ill, is covered with the shade of yonder hill.
The raven, almost famished, joys not more when restless billows tumble to the shore a heap of bodies shipwrecked in the seas than Richard, with these news himself doth please. He now diverts his course another way, and with his army, led in fair array, ascends the rising ground, and, taking view of Henry's soldiers, sees they are but few. Imperial courage fires his noble breast. He sets a threatening spear within his rest, thus saying,
All true knights on me attend. I soon will bring this quarrel to an end. If none will follow, if all faith be gone, behold, I go to try my cause alone.
He strikes his spurs into his horse's side. With him stout Lovell and bold Ferrers ride. To them brave Radcliffe, generous Clifton haste, old Brackenbury scorns to be the last, as born with wings, all worthy spirits fly, resolved for safety of their prince to die. And Catesby to this number adds his name, though pale with fear, yet overcome with shame. Their boldness Richmond dreads not, but admires. He sees their motion like to rolling fires, which by the wind along the fields are borne amidst the trees, the hedges, and the corn, where they the hopes of husbandmen consume, and fill the troubled air with dusky fume. Now, as a careful lord of neighbouring grounds, he keeps the flame from entering in his bounds. Each man is warned to hold his station sure, prepared with courage, strong assaults to endure, but all in vain. No force, no warlike art from sudden breaking can preserve that part where Richard, like a dart from thunder, falls. His foes give way. and stand as brazen walls on either side of his enforced path, while he neglects them and reserves his wrath for him whose death these threatening clouds would clear, whom now with gladness he beholdeth near, and all those faculties together brings which move the soul to high and noble things. Even so, a tiger having followed long the huntress' steps that robbed her of her young, when first she sees him is by rage inclined her steps to double, and her teeth to grind. Now, horse to horse, and man is joined to man so strictly that the soldiers hardly can their adversaries from their fellows know. Here each brave champion singles out his foe. In this confusion, Brackenbury meets with Hungerford, and him thus foully greets.
Ah, traitor, false in breach of faith and love, what discontent could thee in Bourchier move, who had so long my fellows been in arms to fly to rebels? What seducing charms could on your clouded minds such darkness bring, to serve an outlaw and neglect the king?
With these sharp speeches, Hungerford, enraged to uphold his honour, thus the battle waged.
Thy doting age
Saith he,
delights in words, but this aspersion must be tried with swords.
then, leaving talk, he by his weapons speaks, and drives a blow, which Brackenbury breaks, by lifting up his left hand, else the steel had pierced his burgonet, and made him feel the pangs of death. But now the fury fell upon the hand that did the stroke repel, and cuts so large a portion of the shield, that it no more can safe protection yield. Bold Hungerford disdains his use to make of this advantage, but doth straight forsake his massy target, rendered to his squire, and saith,
Let cowards such defence desire.
This done, these valiant knights dispose their blades, and still the one the other's face invades, till Brackenbury's helmet giving way to those fierce strokes that Hungerford doth lay, is bruised and gapes, which Bourchier, fighting near, perceives, and cries,
Brave Hungerford, forbear, bring not those silver hairs to timeless end. He was and may be once again our friend.
But, oh, too late. The fatal blow was sent from Hungerford, which he may now repent but not recall, and digs a mortal wound in Brackenbury's head, which should be crowned with precious metals and with bays adorned for constant truth appearing, when he scorned to stain his hand in those young princes' blood, and like a rock against the ocean stood against the tyrant's charms and threats unmoved, though death declares how much he Richard loved.
Stout Ferrers aims to fix his mighty lance in Pembroke's heart, which on the steel doth glance, and runs in vain the empty air to press, but Pembroke's spear, obtaining wished success, through Ferrers' breastplate, and his body sinks, and vital blood from inward vessels drinks.
Here Stanley and brave Lovell try their strength, whose equal courage draws the strife to length. They think not how they may themselves defend. To strike is all their care, to kill their end. So meet two bulls upon adjoining hills of rocky Charnwood, while their murmur fills the hollow crags, when, striving for their bounds, they wash their piercing horns in mutual wounds. If in the name of such a bloody fight, the name of friendship be not thought too light, recount, my muse, how Byron's faithful love to dying Clifton did itself approve. For Clifton, fighting bravely in the troop, receives a wound and now begins to droop, which Byron seeing, though in arms his foe, in heart his friend, and hoping that the blow had not been mortal, guards him with his shield from second hurts, and cries,
Dear Clifton, yield thou hither camest, led by sinister fate, against my first advice. Yet now, though late, take this my counsel.
Clifton thus replied,
It is too late, for I must now provide to seek another life. Live thou, sweet friend, and when thy side obtains a happy end, upon the fortunes of my children look. Remember what a solemn oath we took, that he whose part should prove the best in fight, would with the conqueror try his utmost might, to save the other's lands from ruinous pause, which seize on fragments of luckless cause. My father's fall our house had almost drowned, but I by chance aboard in shipwreck found. I never more such danger threaten mine. Deal thou for them as I would do for thine.
This said, his senses fail and powers decay, while Byron calls,
Stay, worthy Clifton, stay, and hear my faithful promise once again, which if I break, may all my deeds be vain.
But now he knows that vital breath is fled, and needless words are uttered to the dead. Into the midst of Richard's strength he flies, presenting glorious acts to Henry's eyes, and for his service he expects no more than Clifton's son from forfeits to restore.
While Richard, bearing down with eager mind the steps by which his passage was confined, lays hands on Henry's standard as his prey. Strong Brandon bore it, whom this fatal day marks with a black note as the only knight that on the conquering part forsakes the light. But time, whose wheels with various motions run, repays this service fully to his son, who marries Richmond's daughter, born between two royal parents and endowed a queen. When now the king perceives that Brandon strives to save his charge, he sends a blow that rives his skull in twain, and by a gaping hole gives ample scope to his departing soul, and thus insults.
Accursed wretch, farewell. Thine ensigns now may be displayed in hell. There thou shalt know it is an odious thing to let thy banner fly against thy king.
With scorn he throws the standard to the ground, when Cheyne, for his height and strength renowned, steps forward to cover Richmond, now exposed to Richard's sword. King with Cheyne closed, and to the earth this mighty giant felled. Then, like a stag whom fences long withheld from meadows, where the spring in glory reigns, now having levelled these unpleasing chains and treading proudly on the vanquished flowers, he in his hopes 1,000 joys devours, for now no power to cross his end remains, but only Henry, whom he never deigns to name his foe, and thinks he shall not brave a valiant champion, but a yielding slave.
Alas, how much deceived, when he shall find an able body and courageous mind. For Richmond boldly doth himself oppose against the king, and gives him blows for blows, who now confesseth with an angry frown his rival not unworthy of the crown. The younger Stanley then no longer stayed. The earl in danger needs his present aid, which he performs as sudden as the light. His coming turns the balance of the fight.
So threatening clouds, whose fall the ploughmen fear, which long upon the mountain's top appear, dissolve at last, and vapors then distill to watery showers that all the valleys fill. The first that saw this dreadful storm arise was Catesby, who to Richard loudly cries,
No way but swift retreat your life to save. It is no shame with wings to avoid the grave.
This said, he trembling turns himself to fly, and dares not stay to hear the king reply, who scorning his advice as foul and base, returns this answer with a wrathful face.
Let cowards trust their horses' nimble feet, and in their course with new destruction meet. Gain thou some hours to draw thy fearful breath. To me, ignoble flight is worse than death.
But at the approach of Stanley's fresh supply, the king's side droops. So generous horses lie unapt to stir, or make their courage known, which under cruel masters sink and groan.
There at his prince's foot stout Ratcliffe dies, not fearing, but despairing Lovell flies, for he shall after end his weary life in not so fair, but yet as bold a strife. The king maintains the fight, though left alone, For Henry's life he fain would change his own. And as a lioness which compassed round with troops of men receives a smarting wound by some bold hand, though hindered and oppressed with other spears, yet slighting all the rest will follow him alone that wronged her first, so Richard, pressing with revengeful thirst, admits no shape but Richmond's to his eye, and would in triumph on his carcass die.
But that great God, to whom all creatures yield, protects his servant with a heavenly shield. His power, in which the earl securely trusts, rebates the blows and falsifies the thrusts.
The king grows weary and begins to faint. It grieves him that his foes perceive the taint. Some strike him that till then durst not come near, with weight and number they to ground him bear, where, trampled down and hewed with many sword, he softly uttered these his dying words.
Now strength no longer fortune can withstand. I perish in the center of my land.
His hand he then with wreaths of grass enfolds, and bites the earth which he so strictly holds, as if he would have borne it with him hence, so loath he was to lose his right's pretense.
And thus closes the battle. It was a long day. It went quite badly for quite a lot of people. There's sort of no point me saying whether I was confused or followed things, because I've got lots of notes and I've done this before. But a lot of people in this room haven't read this one before, and I am aware that there are bits of it which are a little opaque. I mean, you do have the advantage. There are some notes in the sides that I've been adding things to clarify who certain people are, and how certain bits function. But yeah, so it's very much a question of what elements, where were you lost? Who were you confused by? There are occasional bits where we've been noting as to which narrator maybe, and we may change how the narration will flow between different readers. I'll go to Alan, then I'll go to Greg.
Yeah, when Ferrers came back at one point, Eric did put in the chat that there's a question with that one. And it didn't quite feel right when I was saying it.
It didn't. I mean, the doubling, you wouldn't be doubled that way. But I was looking at that as I made a note at the time. I don't recall finding a slam dunk that was wrong. But maybe we'll have a little look at that in a bit, because I think that was right in the sense that you have various. That's the point when they're talking about shall we kill the hostage, and you've got various people pleading with the king as to maybe you shouldn't kill the hostage now. Maybe that's not a good move. But yes, because it's the question of Percy and Ferrers as well as Richard and who's saying what at what point, because it is occasionally not clear. So that may or may not be an error. Greg,
I must admit I may not be with it today, but I've felt like the old line, you feel like you're going through all the English cricket teams, but not quite in that way, but also as really obscure people. I feel like you either need your who's who or just sort of clarify some of the names, because even me, who's read a lot about this period, really didn't recognise half the people that kept popping up. Yeah. And I thought Bourchier was an archbishop, so I was completely confused.
Yeah, because there are some who don't matter. I mean, it's like I've literally typed into there's a bit when they mention two people, and it's like they're just a couple of randos. We don't need to know anything about them. But I think the one that's really confusing is the bit with Oxford and Surrey and Norfolk, and just by saying those three combined counties, that you hit the basic problem, because what you've got is a father being killed, his son seeing him being killed, and the very other combatants going on. And it's a matter of how do we clarify that. Whereas if you're sitting and reading a poem, then you can take a little time and unpick it. But as a narrative flow, it is a different thing. Aliki.
I agree that bit is really quite confusing. what kind of staging are we talking about? Because, I mean, there are things we could do. They could all wear a particular shade of blue on their right sleeve and have a coat of arms as well, kind of thing. You know.
Well, there are a combination of things. So the first half, we will do a who's who. I mean, literally, we will actually, all the important players, or specifically will go over certain scenes, in fact, in advance to say, look, this bit is a bit confusing, because I'm trying to avoid changing names within the text, because I know sometimes we use different names throughout for the actual final run at it. But also for the live show itself, I mean, ignoring the problems of recording it as well, we were talking about maybe we'll actually do some of the shields and some of the banners that are about in this, because, again, during the Oxford, Surrey, etc. Clash, they're explicitly talking about the arms of the various people. Mm-hmm. So actually we could put in, at least for the live audience, visual signifiers to really clarify that, as well as, of course, they will be different speakers, they will be squaring off against each other, and of course we haven't discussed sound effects, because a lot of melons could lose their lives during the course of this show, and I'm debating whether to do live Foley or not, because the problem with live Foley is sometimes it can be very effective, but it can also be a bit comic, and the last thing I want is to people laugh at the deaths during the Battle of Bosworth, and it's sort of a decision I have yet to make. Certainly lots of death cries and things are possible, because I say a lot of these people do not make it out. I've been making a list at the top of the text as to who dies during the battle, and quite a lot of these people do. Very few of them very young, actually. Most of them are sort of middle-aged or above. Lois.
Yeah, I'm just slightly confused as to what you're planning here. I mean, you want visual effects, but then it's also going to be audio only with sound effects, and then the visual effects presumably don't include mimed combat, do they? I mean, are people just reading and holding symbolic signs, or are they in fact meant to be learning the lines and acting them?
Oh no, there won't be any learning of lines. There might be some mime going on. There may be some stuff going on, because we'll have spare bodies. Again, the question of how developed it will go. I am thinking some way further down the line that we will actually do a fully staged version of this, where we would interfere with the text and tweak names and add additional things to make it clear. There is a certain composite quality to this, because I'm trying to decide what compromises I'm making where for which version, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's there is a certain flanginess over this.
Right. I wondered if you knew Monteverdi's Combat of Tancred and Clorinda, which was written to be, there's a narrator who sings, and then, there's a whole sung text, mainly a narrator, but also some lines for Tancred and Clorinda, two other singers, and meanwhile, two dancers are miming the whole thing. I just wondered if you were thinking of something like that.
I'd say I'm thinking that's the production after this, in the sense that this is going to be a one-off event that's going to be script in hand, to create audio for the podcast, but we will, for the audience watching, give them more of a show. There will be some visual stuff going on. There'll be lights, there'll be things, there'll be lots of bodies on stage doing things, but not necessarily going all that way. I say I would quite like then to take this and adapt the text in a much more overt way. But as at the moment, I want a nice recording that is textually quite accurate. But that doesn't mean to say I won't make some tweaks. I'm just sort of trying to decide whether it's worth making tweaks, or whether we just say, hopefully they were paying attention in the first half, and when we explained everything before we did it. And we've got an hour to set up a text that runs at 47 minutes, as it ran here, and bits of it will run faster, bits of it will run slower, but I think between 45 and 50 minutes long is a reasonable running time. Alan?
I think actually it doesn't need an awful lot of interpolation. If you've given the background in part one, this does flow, and it's got a pace to it, it's got an energy to it. And I think actually putting too much either action or narrative around it would actually slow the whole thing down a bit.
It's an interesting question about pace and about flow, because this is a poem. It sort of has its own driving rhythm, and it's a matter of how often we break that, because it can get repetitive. It's also a question of whether I break the narrators up more than I have, because do I have a genealogy narrator to just do the genealogy bit to say, hi, this bit doesn't matter very much, because the genealogy is very Stuart specific to a very specific point in time, and is the kind of bit that in a production you'd sort of just quietly cut if you were doing a more adaptive version rather than the full text. Eric, then Lois.
What I found myself paying attention to more than like Richard and Richmond was actually the individual ones, like like Hungerford and Bourchier, or I don't know how you pronounce that, okay, obviously I read Clifton and Byron, but I mean those were like those moments felt like it was slowing down a bit, whereas Richard and Richmond are like vying for each other, they're trying to kill each other, they're very like it's like too, I don't know. It's interesting to look at sort of how the pace changes throughout the poem as well.
Yeah, and the fact that we effectively have a series of one-to-one combats going on throughout the narrative as well. So we have these moments where we could isolate it a bit and almost section it off so that you get a sense of those moments, and it's also like the sort of the random moment where we go. And just to remind everyone that there were quite a lot of French people involved in this battle, which again is a good important. The history of this is pretty good, actually. I've been reading up on modern theories about the battle now, especially as they think they've actually found where it is. They built the visitor centre about 2 miles in the wrong place. So it does seem to be actually quite tight. I mean, there are some exaggerations and issues. We still have a couple of moments of ableism that are clear exaggerations of actuality, but we can't suggest that it's really on the Plantagenet side. But a lot of the details do chime reasonably well. Lois, I think earlier, and then Aliki.
Yeah, well, I used to visit Bosworth Field fairly often from Leicester. I mean, it was a good place to take visitors, and they had a whole plan of the battle. And you could also watch the last 15 minutes, I think, of the Olivier film. And it was quite striking how close that was, in fact, to some of what seems to have happened. What puzzled me a bit in this was that Richard appeared to be riding uphill when he decided to attack Richmond, whereas the impression I always had was that he was started out in a very good position on the high ground, and then for some crazy reason decided to charge downhill, presumably thinking that he could attack Richmond and kill him, and in a sort of daring event, which is rather like what's described here. I mean, the idea that he thought he could get at Richmond, but he seems to be going uphill rather than downhill, although it's not absolutely clear from the text.
I make a note on that because I haven't got round to doing typography yet, but because I'm sure in the first half we will do some charts and things, and I haven't, as I say, ruled out yet using some projection and doing some images that way, which is a very quick way of doing things. The only reason I don't like doing projection for this is just you have the hum, and I have to then remove the hum of the projector, but it's actually not that difficult to do because it's a consistent background noise. Anyway, Aliki.
I was slightly puzzled by the mention of ableism. I'm not sure how you can remove ableism from any story about Richard III because it's so much part of his legend.
Oh no, it's I wouldn't remove it. I'd frame it, but there are texts that are considerably more and considerably less. This really only mentions it in passing a few times. It's actually surprisingly light on that, but it does reinforce that he was a fearsome fighter. It does give Richard his due in that sense. He does randomly murder someone right at the beginning of the text. Just go, you're asleep on duty, die. Which I suppose is a management technique. They firmly land on the killing children thing. But it does give him a character that is human. And real. I mean, Lynn, you may disagree. You were reading him.
No, I was going to sort of echo that one of the things I enjoyed about this is that Richard is not a cartoon villain. He may be on the wrong side, but they refer to him as the king. They don't call him like just by his given name. They don't call him the usurper or whatever. He's the king. And he's very brave. He's got enormous physical courage. I think that also serves to make Richmond's victory more meaningful. The fact that he has a very fearsome foe. But yeah, I like the fact that it kind of gives him his due as a warrior. He's not afraid. It's like, I'd rather die fighting, and that's something that was really deeply admired in this period. So yeah, I like the fact that he's characterized that way.
Lois.
Yeah. I think most of the contemporary accounts do say that when someone offered to give him a chance to flee from the battle, he refused. So at least that seems to be a consistent part of the narrative. But I wonder if Beaumont is having to be pretty careful anyway. I mean, any rebellion against an anointed king is a sort of dodgy thing in the reign of the Stuarts, and he's got to make it really clear that there are a lot of people on Richard's side who are loyal to the concept of the king, even though they hate him. And it's kind of a delicate balance I think he's trying to get here.
Yes, and for a text that is pre-Civil War, but the potential of Civil War is building. There's a lot of stuff that will resonate in the future, in the sense that you've got people who are on different sides, but who were friends, and had really questioned should they change sides or not, and people who've changed sides quite happily, and so you have this question of allegiance and when people's allegiances lie, but also they're just these are all people who grew up together, and I say I think the general age range is relatively older, sort of most of them are in their 40s, 50s, or older. So they've been about each other for a long time. It's not like this is Richmond really is the youngest guy in the room. There are very few people of his age in this narrative, apart from the canon fodder. Lois.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the interesting things about it, that a lot of these people had already fought in previous battles in the Wars of the Roses. I mean, it's mentioned a number of times, other places, other battles, and other places they'd known each other. I think, again, I don't know, maybe a genealogical chart or something indicating people's relationships and what they'd done before might help. I mean, that would presumably all come in the preparation. I think it's one of the rather interesting things in the poem, that it does take a kind of long view of it, and it reminds you of what some of these people did before they got onto this battlefield.
And it's I like it structurally as well, that it starts at dawn and it basically finishes with okay, it doesn't wait until everyone goes to bed or anything, but it takes us almost through a sort of 24-hour period, in that sense of you start the beginning of the battle, everybody getting up, and then and it starts really bang in. It's quite jarring, actually. That's one of the things I think I need to just slightly guide people in, just as we start the second half, when we do the poem as itself, of just getting them into that zone, because it's just sort of wow, I'm awake now, stuff, and the dream ghosts that are going on. Lois, then Aliki.
I mean, the ending is also really quite abrupt. I think he's thinking of something like, I think it's the end of the Aeneid, isn't it? That Turnus just dies very rapidly, and that's it, if I remember rightly. I mean, there's no sort of, and then they all said, hooray, Richmond has won, and crowned him. I mean, nothing like that happens. Richard just dies, and that's it, and dies, angrily clutching at the grass.
He bites the earth.
Yeah.
And I think that is the thing, is that actually that last moment does need to be stretched out in performance to really do the agonized sort of death rattle, as it were. I'm not quite sure, slow fade to black, precisely how to go with that. Aliki.
I don't actually have anything to say, because I was going to say that, only less well.
It's well, I like it my way. I was sort of going through it, just checking how many different people were called the Earl. I think mostly it's just Richmond. I don't think the Earl is used very often for people who are other earls, because that's, I say, the general nomenclature is it's the king and it's the earl, which is good because Richmond and Richard are very irritating as sounds.
Annoying.
So it's quite helpful, but I must double check how many earls are different earls in case. I say it's difficult. I don't want to standardize names because you end up skewing the verse, which is sort of the problem. Unless I just have someone in the corner going, that is the Earl of, like in the quiz show when they University Challenge zooming in on Henry Tudor, Wales, to make that clear. So yeah, I'd already sort of zoomed in on the problem of the bit with Oxford and Surrey and Norfolk, that exchange. Were there any other specific bits where you just went, I have no idea what's going on? We've also got the Percy one as well earlier, just as more about speakers, I think, rather than situation. Lois.
Well, there's just one bit, I have to find it, where I was just puzzled. I wondered whether 2 lines had somehow got missed out or something. I think it was that funny reference to the planet, which everybody thought might be Mars, but it just seemed to come out of nowhere.
That angry planet, yeah, because I was looking for Mars at that point as well. So that's because I don't. No, that, I mean, by and large, any errors in the text are very minor. It's a letter here or a letter there. I haven't noticed much, but that doesn't mean to say there isn't.
I just kept thinking there must have been some previous reference to something that referred to.
I'm just going to highlight that, see if there's anything else there. So this is more of a dance around. Yeah, it's difficult to find in the original. Eric, while I hunt.
Basically, like a lot of the stuff that confused me was basically not entirely genealogy stuff. Like you've got descriptions of, because I'm not very good with the history. Okay, I'm more the fiction. So there was a bit where it's like, oh, but time, whose wheels with various motion run, or pays this service fully to his son, who marries Richmond's daughter, and I'm like, who the hell are we talking? Okay, yes. Now, I mean, historically, I was like, I need to Google this, just because there's a part of me going, history, what? Yeah.
Oh yeah. You know what that is? Did you ever? You probably never read a novel called When Knighthood Was in Flower. It was I think a 19th century historical novel, but that's about Charles Brandon, who I think is the one that marries the princess.
Yeah. Any more for any more? I make a note. I think there's an element of once I break it down sort of into scenes where we can make the scene pop in its own right as well. I think rather than, whereas this exercise is all about crashing through it, and even the first look was still sort of just getting to grips with it. There is that sense that making individual moments pop as well as just by being different actors as well. Whereas we didn't really do a proper doubling, so it made sense and gave people a chance to figure out who they were for this exercise. Otherwise, I will go to final thoughts. Final thoughts around the room about Bosworth Field. I can't remember, Alan, if we actually read through this about 4 years ago before we started doing online Zoom sessions, but we might have done because we did a lot of Richard III stuff. Any final thoughts?
I have no recollection of this. Obviously, I've got recollections of other bits we've dealt with concerning Richard and the Tudor takeover, and the Stanleys behaving in a fairly standard aristocratic manner of, oh, well, let's see which side's winning and we'll join them. But no, I mean, the thing seems to work quite nicely. It's got pace, it's got energy. And I think you probably have audiences leaving the theatre quite well satisfied, even without an awful lot of backstory explanation, but you probably need that to fill the evening up.
Well, it's not entirely. Yeah, it's not entirely a cynical exercise in filling the evening, but I do think it definitely will help to key everyone in. Lynn, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I enjoyed this more than I thought I would. I didn't realize that it was actually. I mean, I knew it was a narrative poem, but I didn't realize that it was actually so dramatic that you have direct discourse through a lot of it. And I like the actioniness of it, the way the battles are described. I like the fact that Richard is portrayed as, if not good, at least a formidable and very courageous opponent. And I like the ending. I would kind of go back to that idea that it does end out rather abruptly. I kind of like that about it. And that's sort of, the fact that we talk about the Stuarts as sort of the providential royal family in the middle of it, and then we just end with the battle but we get to skip over the desecration of Richard's body and the fact that Henry VII was actually a deeply unpopular king. We still don't have to talk about it. So I think as a drama, like isolated out of the historical narrative, I think that abrupt ending is actually a really good choice. I think it's really effective.
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of end rather like a Hammer horror film in the sense that the evil person dies, the house is burnt on fire, and then immediately cut to the end. There's no coda at all to this. Aliki, any final thoughts?
I really enjoyed it. Partly that's because the narration is just a great deal of fun. It's something between I don't know, you get to moralize, you get to empathize, you get to draw these scenes of action. I thought it was enormously enjoyable, and I think the whole poem has a lot of potential to it. I think, let's keep working on it.
Fabulous. Lois, any final thoughts?
Well, I thought it was a good poem, and certainly it was very enjoyable reading the narration. I suppose you could dress the two narrators in very obviously sort of Charles I type costumes, quite different from everybody else, or make it clear that they are speaking from a particular point of view. But I thought it was quite exciting, really. I mean, there's a lot of action, and the depiction of Richard is very good, and even though those various confrontations between people, some of them are rather moving, I think.
Greg, any final thoughts to throw in?
Yeah, no, just very enjoyable. It was fun to hear a different take on it. And so looking forward to hearing the finished product, if not before.
Eric, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think well, I mean, I can't remember what I said last time during the first session, but anyway, it was, it was interesting how now this time I noticed different things than the first times, where like I kind of, the imagery really popped out. Like, I don't know, for example, on this page, I've got two bulls upon adjoining hills of rocky charnwood and stuff. And then you've got this thing of sort of, like, the imagery is pretty, so long as you know what you're talking about, because the bit with the French lilies in Italian Alps, I mean, okay, that could also refer to other times throughout history. So there's a part of me going, which battle are we talking about? Or like Caledonian, what was it? I can't remember the line. Caledonian mountains, like lads born from Caledonian mountains and stuff. And it's like, you have to make sure your actors know who they are talking about, and also maybe it would be helpful for the audiences.
Yes, because it is that thing of that I'm adding more and more glosses to the text for the actors, but it's then, as I say, writing the first half of the show to do the glosses for the audience. So it's there is an entire essentially hours worth of narrative for me to construct around this narrative, which is my job for the next few months. Rachel, welcome to this first session. Any final thoughts you want to throw in?
No, I was just happy to have you let me stumble through this first read, so thank you.
So this is part of a sort of ongoing project looking at looking quite a lot of Richard III material, a lot of which is poetry rather than plays. I've already done The Ghost of Richard III. That's available on the YouTube, which is recorded at the same place as this show will be happening in my relative future, a few months' time. But also on the podcast, we've looked at other texts, the Song of Lady Bessie. There is another Bosworth field we haven't looked at yet, a much earlier one, which is semi-history. And also there is the I forget the precise title, but the Taking of the Crown, written by Richard III himself. But it's written from Richard's point of view, which actually is quite a nice counterpoint to this, in the sense that it literally tells Richard tells his own life story up to the point of Battle of Bosworth. So he's, the night before he was writing his autobiography, and then the next day it's Bosworth. So part of me is tempted to team the two together, but not for this show. But you can listen to that on the podcast. All of the links should be in the show description when this goes out. It should go out publicly to the world after we've recorded the show. But it will go out to our patrons earlier. Yes, all that remains to thank all our wonderful readers for all their wonderful reading. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye. There at his prince's foot, stout Radcliffe dies, not fearing but despairing Lovell flies.